Welcome and thank you for tuning into A Sound Constitution on CHLY 101.7 FM with Lindsay, Manisha, Nilafar, Sanas, and Kristen. We are fourth-year Bachelor of Science in Nursing students at Vancouver Island University in Nanaimo.
We are working to demystify health issues affecting our community, bringing you evidence-based information about our healthcare. This information is for educational purposes only and does not replace the advice of your primary healthcare provider.
We'd like to start our show by acknowledging and thanking the Coast Salish people whose unceded territory we have the opportunity to live, learn, and share educational experiences on.
Good morning, CHLY listeners. This is your host, Lindsay. My pronouns are she and her. I am with my co-host, Manisha.
Hello, this is Manisha, and my pronouns are also she and her.
You may be wondering why we are introducing ourselves with our pronouns. Well, today we are going to be discussing creating an inclusive environment for members in our community who identify as part of the LGBTQ2S+ community. We will also be discussing how this is related to the health of our LGBTQ2S+ community members and what we can do individually to create inclusiveness.
As a disclaimer, most of us identify as cisgender and do not look to speak on behalf of the LGBTQ2S+ community. We look to promote and create awareness to the LGBTQ2S+ community so that we can create a safe and inclusive space for everyone. If we use any terms incorrectly, we do not do so intentionally. And please let us know so we can learn and grow with the community.
In order to start talking about building an LGBTQ2S+ inclusive community, first we need to define these groups.
LGBT HealthLink BC and TransCare BC through the Provincial Health Services Authority define the commonly used words when referring to the LGBTQ2S+ community. So, LGBTQ2S+ is an evolving acronym for lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, two-spirit, queer, and additional identities. Queer. It can be used to refer to the range of non-heterosexual and non-cisgender people. This term is often used as a short form of LGBTQ2S+. Some LGBTQ2S+ people are offended by this word, but others have reclaimed it.
Many people mistakenly believe that being trans is a sexual orientation. Sexual orientation is fundamentally different from gender identity. Sexual orientation includes pattern of emotional, romantic, or sexual attraction to groups of people, such as men, women, and trans people. A person's sense of identity based on those attractions, their behaviors, and their membership in a community of others who share those attractions is also part of sexual orientation. Manisha, what terms are often used when discussing sexual orientation?
So here are some terms that I'll talk about and their description. First is heterosexual. That describes a person who's attracted only or almost only to the other gender. Homosexual, gay, lesbian, queer, describes a person attracted only or almost only to those of the same gender. Bisexual describes a person attracted to both men and women, though not necessarily equally or at the same time. Pansexual or omnisexual describes a person attracted to those of any gender. Asexual describes someone not sexually attracted to any gender. This is different from deciding not to have sex with anyone. That is abstinence or celibacy. Ally, a heterosexual person who supports and celebrates all identities, challenges discriminatory remarks and actions of others and willingly explores these biases within themselves. Bi is the shortened form or term for bisexual. Coming out or coming out of the closet is the process of becoming aware of one's queer sexual orientation, one's two-spirit or trans identity, accepting it and telling others about it. Gay refers to a man or woman, either cisgender or transgender, who is attracted only or almost only to those of the same gender, often used to refer to men only. Straight is another term for heterosexual. Lesbian refers to a woman, either cisgender or transgender, who is primarily attracted to women. Note that this does not include all LGBTQ2S+ terminology, because many of those terms fall under gender identity and expression, which Lindsay can tell us a bit about.
So, what is gender identity or gender expression? Everyone has both a gender identity and a sexual orientation. Like anybody, trans people are asexual, straight, heterosexual, bisexual, lesbian, pansexual, omnisexual, queer, gay, or something else. Gender identity and gender expression are terms which can also be confused with one another. While a person's gender identity and gender expression are often similar, they do not always match. A person may express gender in a way that differs from how they feel on the inside. So, gender identity is the internal and psychological sense of oneself as a woman, a man, both, in between, or neither. Only you can determine your gender identity. Gender expression is how one outwardly shows gender, including through name and pronoun choice, style of dress, voice, or hairstyle. Gender expression may be referred to as masculine, feminine, or androgynous. A person may change how they express themselves depending on the situation they are in, like at a business meeting, home alone, or out with friends. Cisgender is a person whose gender identity matches the sex they were assigned at birth. For example, a woman and a female. This may also be shortened to cis. Transgender or transsexual is a term that describes a wide range of people whose gender and or gender expression differ from their assigned sex and the societal and cultural expectations of their assigned sex. Sometimes shortened to trans, as in trans man or trans woman. We use the word trans as an umbrella term to describe a wide range of people whose gender identity or gender expression differ from their assigned sex or the societal and cultural expectations of their assigned sex. We do this to be as inclusive as possible to all people who are trans and gender diverse. The term trans includes, but is not limited to, people who are agender, bigender, female to male, gender creative, gender fluid, gender queer, male to female, non-binary, pangender, transgender, trans man, trans woman, trans feminine, trans masculine, and transsexual.
Two-spirit is a term used by an indigenous person to describe their spiritual, gender, and sexual identity. This will be further explained in our next section. This information was found on healthlinkbc.ca and phsa.ca/transcarebc. These are great resources that you can use to find more information on this topic.
Up next, we have a TED Talk by Nicholas Metcalf called Why We Need Gender Fluidity. In his talk, Nick Metcalf gives insight into his experiences being a two-spirit and explains why gender fluidity is necessary in today's world.
Nick Metcalf is an enrolled member of the Rosebud Sioux tribe, South Dakota, where he grew up. Nick attended the University of South Dakota for their bachelor's in science and received their master's of social work in family therapy at Osberg College. Nick currently works for the Minnesota Department of Human Services and is an active volunteer on a variety of community projects and initiatives impacting communities of color.
Hello, everybody. My name is Chantanji, which means yellow hawk. I'm an enrolled member of the Rosebud Sioux tribe. I'm Sichangogoyate. I'm one of the Burnt Thigh people, and I'm two-spirited. One of the things I want to talk to you today about is being two-spirited. It's a cultural concept. It's a cultural teaching in how we sort of are in the world. Gay and lesbian folks in indigenous tribes have been celebrated for many, many centuries, long before America was created. And when America came along, I always tell folks it's like people were living here already, and so it's important to remember that there were thriving societies here long before America was created, and I'm one of them. Two-spiritedness. It's an embodiment of male and female identity. It's an indigenous concept. One of the things I do want to say is that it's a sacred space. Weewa is one of our more famous two-spirit folks. Will Roscoe studied her in the late 1800s, an anthropologist. She's famous because she met President Cleveland and the Zuni Man-Woman by Will Roscoe. And they did not discover she was a man until later in her life. In order to understand this sort of concept of two-spiritedness, I need you to sort of step away from sort of American culture and how you sort of view and identify gender and sexuality and all those sorts of things in order to look at Native culture from that point of view. Because one of the things, as I prepared for the talk today, it was really difficult because folks really need to sort of step into an indigenous worldview to understand that everything is sacred and everything has use, and the Creator makes no mistake. And from our tribal communities, of the 566 tribal communities in this country, most everybody has a two-spirited person. And in our languages, we actually have folks, in my language, I'm known as a Winkte. I'm a third-gendered person. And one of the things for us, we're storytellers, we teach sacred ceremonies, we're the person that could go between men and women. So we're sort of the bridge builder. And a lot of our creation stories talk about two-spirited people coming to save the world. In 1990, a group of Native activists, gay and lesbian activists, coined the term two-spiritedness to sort of combat the idea that in anthropology we're known as Badarch, which means male prostitute or slave. And so these are some images of two-spirited people that I know and love. And so one of the things for us is that reclamation process of identity, because we exist in multiple worlds in terms of the gay and lesbian community and within our Native communities. And I don't want you to sort of go away today sort of thinking that in Native culture that there's sort of, everybody has sort of accepted two-spirited people, because remember, we have been colonized and assimilated into America. And so some of those values that we were sort of taught are lost. And so right now, a lot of two-spirit people are actually reteaching those lessons. But if you meet traditional Native folks, they will tell you stories about us. So this is my story. So I left a reservation. I was born and raised on Rosebud Reservation in South Dakota. And one of the things I've sort of learned over the years is that reservations are actually prison of war camps. And I was born and raised there, and I left the reservation at the urging of my parents, who sort of said, go discover the world, there are more people like you. And so I left and went to the University of South Dakota, studied at the University of South Dakota, but I found it really difficult to it's a really different worldview that I had to sort of come into. I grew up in a very indigenous household, but came into America where values were very contradictory to each other. And sort of I had to understand what it meant to be American. Although we lived in America, it's a very sort of isolated sort of place, especially in rural South Dakota. And so for me, one of the things I always like to tell folks is I came out as gay first before I came out as an Indian. Because one of the things I joined at the University of South Dakota, I joined the Gay and Lesbian Student Association. No sooner did I get there. And that was back in the days in 1990 when you had to called the psychology department to find out where the Gay and Lesbian Student Association was meeting. And you met with the psychology professor before you were given the secret location. We've come a long way, haven't we? And so I spent all of my sort of developmental years, early years in college, was actually coming into the movement and finding my space around my sexual identity, but then really sort of struggled with this sort of identity, who I was in the world around being Native. And so I had to sort of reconcile what it meant to be Native in this country. And one of the things I discovered over time was I inherited a lot of trauma from my parents. And unintentionally, they taught me to have pride about myself and to be who I am. But covertly, they also taught me shame. Not because they wanted to, but because that's what they were taught. From Catholic schools who really had this sort of policy that anything but Indian. And so that's what I inherited, and that was that voice I knew. And so in order for me to sort of reconnect with my cultural identity, I really had to help my family heal from that trauma that they experienced here in America. And it's still going on today. These are the women that actually, in my development, those are my grandmother up to the right, my mother on the left, and my aunt. Women that were really instrumental in my life. I was an effeminate kid who grew up around women and socialized around women. I didn't play with cars, I didn't do anything boy stuff. I was brought up in the circle of women. And it wasn't until I was an adult that I actually understood what it was to be around men, because they were just not in my nature to be around men. And so it was as an adult that I came to understand the world of men. And believe me, it's very different. Very, very different. For me, having left the University of South Dakota, coming here to the Twin Cities, I sort of came to sort of experience here in the Twin Cities, which is a really mecca for a lot of critical thinking and a lot of community activism, and found that space where two-spirited people existed. And so could meet other folks and talk story with folks and heal from trauma. And one of the person that also moved me along is my son. I became a parent in 1999. I became a parent of a boy. So this was a real sort of experience for me because I've never been around boys, and here I was responsible for socializing a boy. And I'm like, holy cow, I don't know anything about your world, dude. I don't know how to help you here. My son has been very patient with me because I always sort of look at him and like, oh my God, where did you learn that at? You know, there's this guy handshake, there's this sort of bump hits, and I'm like, where's that come from? I don't talk to my girlfriends like that. We don't do stuff like that. You know, we're hugging, we're kissing, we're screaming, you know, and that's what I know. You know, but going up and giving that hug, I was like, dude, where's that come from? So anyway, so it was my son who taught me this. And one of the things, this was me, I did drag for a number of years until my son was about 4. And it's really difficult to perform and have children. One of the things I always say is like, you know, one time I was doing a show and Sonny was supposed to be, this is my son, he's right there in the middle. He was supposed to be with my friends while I was busy on stage, but he saw me, and so he ran up on stage. So here I'm doing a number, I pick him up, finish the number, doing my number, and I was like, holy shit, it's like, who else does this? I'm the drag queen with kids. And so one of the things about my family, and that's my other son, Joe, we have to come out every year, because both my boys are very active in sports, and so every year we have to come out as a family and our sort of family structure and how we sort of created our family. And we have to sort of, my son insists on calling me mom, and has always called me mom since he was little. Ever since he could speak. I've been a single parent, and so he's called me mom. Even sometimes at my insistence to say to him, call me dad. It'll be safer for you to call me dad. Because people won't laugh at you, they won't make fun of you. It'll be easier for you to try to explain if you just call me dad. But then he would always say to me, but you're my mom. You're my mom. And so every year, one of the years, I always have to come out, and I'm standing there with the dads, because, a lot of dads go to these sports things, and, it's a guy thing, and I'm like, okay, here I go. And so I'm standing there with a bunch of guys, and here's my son comes running up and saying, Mom, 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 Mom. And of course, all the guys are like, what? What are you talking about? Why is he calling you Mom? And I just sort of look at that sort of face, and I'm saying, just go with it. Just don't even think too hard about it. It's our little world, we don't affect your life in any sort of way, so just go with it. I'm the mom. And so one of the things for myself in my journey I came to sort of understand is that, it's human nature to categorize people. Even today when I walked out, I imagine you probably told my life story as soon as I stepped on stage by the look of my hair, by my jewelry, and by the nature, and also my intonation of my voice. So you told my story before I got a chance to tell my story. And so one of the things I've learned in time was that gender does not equal sexuality. Who I'm attracted to and how I express myself in terms of gender are very distinct. And so today, I present myself as a man, and there's particular reasons why I do this. And it's more out of safety. In my experience of sort of going in the world and dressing as a woman, it's unsafe. There's not safety in this world to dress as a woman. And there's a lot of sort of things that I sort of had to struggle with, and because one of the things, I had no personal space anymore. People could touch me, and that was not okay with me. Men sort of assumed that they could cross boundaries that were not okay with me. And I'm like, really? You would never do this with other males, but somehow because I'm dressing as a woman, it's okay for you to come on me like that? And one of the things too, in the transgender community, there's a lot of struggle within the transgender community. You talk about sexual assaults, you talk about poverty, you talk about domestic assaults. My experience in the transgender community is not unique. I had been sexually assaulted one night leaving the bar here in the cities, and I was going home, and one man who said to me, he commented to me earlier that night that I was pretty. And so I was walking home that night alone, which I had done before. It was not a big deal. And it was that man, the one who said I was pretty. And he had this right and claimed ownership of my body in ways that was not okay. And so to this day, I have sort of chosen to present myself in the world for my own safety and for the safety of my family, because I need my kids to be safe. This idea of two-spiritedness is an indigenous concept. And for me, that's where I sort of found a place in the world, and I found safety within my tribal community, and I've grown up in a family who's incredibly supportive of me and who I am. And they love me regardless. It's time to create space for gender fluidity, and that's what I want to leave you with here today. And one of the things, when my son was little, in kindergarten, I would take him to class, and all the little kids would come running up, and they were excited to see me because I'm the mom. I was this novelty. It was like, it's kind of confusing, but that's the mom. I was kind of that thing. And so all the kids would come rushing up on me, and they were like, the mom is here, the mom is here, the mom is here. And they would all surround me, and they'd be all looking at me wide-eyed, and they'd be touching me, and they'd be like, oh my God, you're the mom. And I'm like, yes, I'm the mom. And they would say, are you a boy or a girl? And I would say, what do you need me to be? Because in kindergarten, they're really figuring out their place in the world, and they haven't really got a sense of themselves. And so some would say a boy, I want you to be a boy, I want you to be a girl. And they would answer it, and I'm like, yeah, that's okay. Yeah, I'll be what you need me to be. And then one of the things I would say to them, I'm like, the world's a great big place, and there's lots of different kinds of people, and I'm one of them. Thank you.
That was Nick Metcalf on Why We Need Gender Fluidity, a TED Talk. If you're just tuning in now, you're listening to A Sound Constitution on CHLY 101.7 FM. Up next is Neelafar and Sanas.
Manisha and Lindsay for important and great information. Hello CHLY listeners. This is Nilufar, and in this section, Sanaz and I are going to talk about stigma and its impact on the health of LGBTQ2S+ populations. At first, I'm going to talk about stigma. According to the heretohelp.bc.ca, the term stigma comes from the sharp stick that early Greeks used to tattoo slaves, criminals, and undesirables. Thus, stigma is often defined as a mark of shame, and this is a definition you're likely to find in the dictionary. Recently, however, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities has encouraged us to think about stigma in broader terms as an issue of social justice, and ask us to pay more attention on how social and organizational structures perpetuate inequalities for marginalized people with mental health, physical impairments, or LGBTQ2S+ population. From this perspective, stigma is not a mark of shame borne by the individual. Rather, stigmatization is a complex social process that results in discrimination and social inequity. The research literature describing mental illness-related stigma can be organized into three mechanisms of stigmatization: structural stigma, public stigma, and self-stigma. In this show, we are going to talk about public stigma.
Negative, harmful, and prejudicial images and ideas may lead to unfair treatment and discrimination of marginalized population, including LGBTQ2S+. This can occur in the context of families and friends, and in day-to-day interactions. Public stigma also have a way of sticking to individuals or things closely associated with the individual who has a mental illness. Families may be stigmatized because they are perceived to have caused the illness, or because they are thought to be harboring a dangerous and unpredictable individual. They may lose the support of family networks and friends. Anti-stigma programs targeting public stigma must change the way members of the public think and behave.
According to the Harvard University, nearly a sixth of LGBTQ adults have experienced discrimination at a doctor's office or in another healthcare setting, while a fifth say they have avoided seeking medical care out of fear of discrimination, according to a recent poll. The combination in a population that commonly experiences discrimination and even violence in their day-to-day lives can lead to a cascade of health ills. People who experience discrimination, for example, have been shown to have an increased risk of heart disease, and that risk can be raised further by skirting routine medical care.
The solution, according to panelists at a session sponsored by the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, involves gathering more data to help identify specific health needs of the LGBTQ2S+ population, along with educating health professionals so they better understand that there are differences in care needs and that ignoring them can do damage. There is a ton of research showing that experiencing discrimination is associated with a whole range of negative health outcomes, said Logan Casey, research associate at the Harvard Opinion Research Program. So if you're experiencing this discrimination on such a widespread scale, and it's having all these negative health impacts, and then on top of that, you're not going to a doctor, that is going to compound the effects of discrimination.
The poll by the Harvard Chan School, NPR, and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation examined the experience of discrimination in several populations, including LGBTQ2S+ adults. It found that discrimination is a common feature in their lives, with 57% saying they've been subject to anti-LGBTQ2S+ slurs and 53% to offensive comments about their identity. In addition, 51% said they or a friend or family member who is also an LGBTQ2S+ person have experienced violence. The same percentage said they'd experienced sexual harassment, while 57% said they'd received threats or been subject to non-sexual harassment.
Within this population, there are further disparities based on race. Black LGBTQ2S+ people had higher rates than whites of discrimination on the job and in interaction with police, and more often avoided calling police when in need because they were concerned about discrimination. Infectious disease rates are higher as well, with an estimated 50% of Black transgender women suffering greatly from HIV. Awareness of the differing health needs of the LGBTQ2S+ community is rising. The National Institute of Health has made the community a priority population for research into health disparities, which include an increased risk of adverse health outcomes at the 2 to 5 times that of the general population. More data is needed on the healthcare needs of the LGBTQ2S+ population. They said questions about sexual orientation and gender identity should be added routinely to surveys to help illuminate those needs.
Also, one of the biggest hurdles this population faces involves how unprepared most medical professionals are to take care of them. Despite a push to improve the healthcare industry's cultural competence and better understand the everyday lives and pressure on ethnic and minority patients. According to the Canadian Mental Health Association, although LGBTQ2S+ people are as diverse as the general Canadian population in their experiences of mental health and well-being, they face higher risks of some mental health issues due to the effects of discrimination and the social determinants of health. This information was compiled by Rainbow Health Ontario and Canadian Mental Health Association Ontario. So let's talk about what factors impact on mental health. Socioeconomic factors or determinants play a key role in mental health and well-being for all of us and are particularly important for marginalized populations. 3 significant determinants of positive mental health and well-being are social inclusion, freedom of discrimination and violence, and access to economic resources. All 3 factors impact LGBTQ2S+ individuals and communities. Bisexual and trans people are overrepresented among low-income Canadians. An Ontario-based study found that half of trans people were living on less than $15,000 a year. LGBTQ people experience stigma and discrimination across their lifespans and are targets of sexual and physical assault, harassment, and hate crimes. Hate crimes motivated by sexual orientation more than doubled in Canada from 2007 to 2008 and were the most violent of all hate crimes. An Ontario-based study of trans people found that 20% had experienced physical or sexual assault due to their identity, and that 34% were subjected to verbal threats or harassment. Trans people in both Canada and United States report high levels of violence, harassment, and discrimination when seeking stable housing, employment, health, or social services. Additional factors that may impact on mental health and well-being of LGBTQ2S+ people include the process of coming out or sharing one's LGBTQ2S+ identity with others, gender transition, internalized oppression, isolation, and alienation, loss of family or social support, and impact of HIV and AIDS. So, LGBTQ2S+ individuals may experience multiple forms of marginalization or disadvantage at the same time. For example, an individual's experience may be shaped at the same time by their sexual orientation, racialization, gender disability, and income. For example, a bisexual South Asian woman may have an anxiety disorder and be living in poverty. Intersectionality refers to an approach by which intersecting experiences of marginalization and the needs of the whole person are considered. There are multiple ways that intersectionality impacts the mental health of LGBTQ2S+ people. For example, LGBTQ2+ people may experience other forms of marginalization, such as racism, sexism, poverty, or other factors, alongside homophobia or transphobia that negatively impact on mental health. Additionally, an individual with a mental health condition who is also an LGBTQ2S+ person may face added challenges in accessing mental health services that are appropriate and inclusive, and may face discrimination on the basis of both disability and sexual orientation.
Thank you, Nilafar and Sanas. If you're just tuning in now, you're listening to CHLY 101.7 FM, A Sound Constitution. Today, we're discussing creating an inclusive society. Up next, Kristen is going to give us some tips on how we can be more inclusive.
Hello and welcome back, CHLY listeners. This is Kristen here, and I identify myself as female and use the pronouns she and her. So next we're going to be talking about language and how it has evolved to become more inclusive and look at steps that listeners can take to become better allies. So first, the history of language is that it's been shaped to imply a gender hierarchy. This is evident on how a person might compose their writing and how they may use gender pronouns. As language has changed, though, so does the norms that deem what is acceptable. There's a shift away from practices such as gendered language, terms like fireman and the universal he for all genders, and heteronormative language that reinforces the attitude of heterosexuality is the preferred way of being, towards terminology that is more inclusive, such as using spouse instead of husband or wife, if that's what they prefer. Another change that is happening is the shift towards language that acknowledges a broader variety of gender identities. So, in terms of preferred pronouns, it is important to be aware that a person who is transgender or non-binary, as Lindsay and Manisha had explained, may have a difficult lived experience. Language is important when speaking about gender identity because it facilitates respect by allowing people to use language that describes their identity. Respect can be demonstrated by asking appropriate questions about what language means to any given person and inquiring appropriately into experiences, needs, and concerns. Balancing a practice of using non-gendered-based language, such as they, them, and their, and being sensitive to a person's specific needs will serve one well. Ultimately, making the person's gender a non-issue should be the goal. Some people experience gender as non-binary, that is, some people that have an experience of gender being more than two options of male and female. And some individuals experience their gender as both, or neither, male or female. Further, some may use a variety of terms to describe their gender identity, and they may include agender, androgyne, bigender, genderqueer, gender diverse, gender fluid, gender neutral, gender non-conforming, intergender, neutre, non-binary, polygender, third gender, or two-spirited. So, regardless of a person's identity, gender can be very important to someone's sense of self. To use language that is not inclusive to someone's sense of self can then cause the person to feel disrespected and unwelcome. You may want to consider privately asking about the preferred terms used by an individual. However, referring to someone whose identified pronouns are unknown, it is usually preferable to use non-gendered-based language as they, them, and their. For example, Kristen has an assignment they are working on. So now that we kind of know about preferred pronouns, we're going to talk about gendered pronouns. So a gendered pronoun is a pronoun that references a person's gender, such as hers, his, he, she, him, her, or herself, himself. Pronouns in English originally developed around a binary gender norm, such as male and female. It may not match a person's gender identity or expression. It is it is now considered more inclusive to use gender-neutral pronouns such as they in written and spoken communication. Further, many non-binary and gender-fluid persons prefer the gender-neutral pronoun they in reference to themselves. So, while it was previously acceptable to use male pronouns such as he to stand for all genders, this is now no longer the case. Likewise, terms such as man or mankind no longer reflect the full spectrum of humanity. You may have now heard the use of humankind instead of the use of mankind to refer of everyone across the spectrum of humanity there. The use of the male universal pronoun causes confusion as to whether the language is meant to encompass all genders or just men. It also marginalizes women and other genders that are less likely to identify with this type of language. In the past, people often feminized certain nouns when a female was involved, and therefore actor became actress, poet became poetess, and host became hostess. Feminized nouns may also hold negative connotation, such as in the case with mistress and master. Using regular nouns to refer to an actor, poet, host, and master, regardless of a person's gender, reinforces equal ability of any gender to hold that role. Likewise, one needs to be mindful about the use of masculinized nouns, most commonly used in job titles that reinforce that the norm to hold the role is a male. Inclusive approaches to replace identifiers such as policeman, fireman, and chairman with non-gender titles such as police officer, firefighter, and chair or chairperson. So now that we've talked about gender-neutral terms and pronouns, how can one go about incorporating and creating a more inclusive space? Well, it's as simple as using it yourself. If you must ask which pronoun person uses, start with your own. For example, at the start of this section, I identified myself as Kristen and used the preferred pronouns as she and her. And then you can follow up with, what about you? It is then important when you have the preferred pronouns to use those pronouns as requested. It wouldn't be acceptable if I gave my preferred pronoun as she and her, and someone would refer to me as he and his. And if you don't know which pronoun to use, take the time to listen first. Double-checking the use of terminology and language descriptions confers respect and can contribute to the development of most relationships. If pronouns that a person prefers is not known, listen first to the pronoun the other person uses when referring to themselves. If you accidentally use the wrong pronoun, apologize quickly and sincerely, then move on. The bigger deal you make out of this situation, the more uncomfortable it is for you and the person you're conversing with. And next, you want to be considerate of names. Respect the name a transgender person is currently using. For some people, being associated with their birth name is a source of anxiety, or it is simply a part of their life they wish to leave behind. If you happen to know the name someone was given at birth but no longer uses, refrain from sharing it with others without that person's explicit permission. So if someone used a name with you that doesn't match the identification that you're using, if you're a healthcare professional, for example, use the name that the transgendered person has provided to you. What you may not know is that it costs a lot of money and there's a lot of legal hoops to jump through in order to officially change names and genders on identification. So to be respectful of the trans person, refer to them with their preferred name and gendered terms. So those just seem like pretty simple ways, and we've included them in our show today. But for those that are also looking to be an ally, we have some kind of tips and tricks for you as well. So to be an ally means you need to be vulnerable. Allies need to be able to acknowledge that they don't have all the answers and that they don't understand the experiences of marginalized or oppressed groups. This means having empathy rather than sympathy. So first, you want to acknowledge the privilege you experienced based on being heterosexual and cisgender, among other forms of privilege there, being of a higher socioeconomic class, for example, or sometimes being of a Caucasian descent. Next, continue to take time to learn about LGBTQ2S+ issues. A lot of homophobic and transphobic ideas are based on old ways of thinking. Learning about the history and the contemporary human rights landscape is important to be able to speak accurately to those that may not be as well informed. So being an ally also means knowing when it's safe to be an ally. Sometimes it's not always safe, and you have to be selective when you speak up. For example, if you're on the bus and there's a drunk man challenging or shouting homophobic remarks at someone, it may not be most useful as you can put yourself and the other person in more danger. However, a more appropriate response would be accompanying the person attacked and inviting solidarity from the other riders on the bus. So in this instance, actions definitely speak louder than words. Try to adopt language that is inclusive, as we had previously discussed. Don't assume someone has a boyfriend or girlfriend. Instead, use terms like partner or significant other. Also respect pronouns. Politely correct others when they use the incorrect terms. So, for example, if I was talking with a partner and say they were referring to someone I know with the wrong pronouns, just gently correct them. Say, hey, they prefer the pronouns they and them. Can you please use that going forward? Be more respectful to that person. So just something, don't make it a big deal, but use it respectfully there. Avoid terms like real or biological. Instead, use the term cis. Respect the confidentiality of the LGBTQ2S+ people you meet. Do not out them. Just because someone has shared their sexuality or gender identity with you does not mean that it's common knowledge. Do not disclose someone's sexuality or gender identity without their consent. Many of these people are concerned for their safety, and you may be one of the few people they have told. You should only share if it is relevant. For example, I need to refer a youth to a doctor that is trans positive. Can you recommend a clinic? That is more acceptable than saying, I need to take Sally to the clothing room because she is transgender. That's not acceptable. Next, a big step is to learn to identify homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia, and how it is prevalent in our society. Develop strategies to challenge homophobic and transphobic comments when you hear them, and share those strategies with others. Be willing to have your ideas of sexuality and gender challenge. Acknowledge that your ideas are shaped by your experiences and that others may not share your views. Sexuality and gender identity are social constructs and are constantly evolving. For example, not all women want to wear dresses and not all men want to play sports. Remember, sexuality and gender are not the same thing. Sexuality is about who we find attractive, and gender identity is how we see our gender. And then lastly, lobby for your workplace or environment to be more inclusive. This is more than having posters of rainbows on bulletin boards. Read your organization's or company's policies and procedure manual and make recommendations on what sections need to be updated. Also look for ways your space can include gender-neutral washrooms. And if your organization has women-only spaces, ensure that they're also inclusive trans women. Alright, so thank you so much for joining me here on A Sound Constitution on CHLY 101.7 FM as we talked about using language to become more inclusive and how to become a better ally. If you have any comments or questions about the use of pronouns or would like to correct anything in the segment, please do not hesitate to reach out to us. Thank you, and until next time, listeners.
Thank you, Kristen. That was great information. If you're just tuning in, you're listening to CHLY 101.7 FM, A Sound Constitution. We're discussing building an inclusive society. Up next, Donis is going to give us some information on the resources available to us in the community.
Now let's talk about promoting positive mental health and well-being in LGBTQ2S+ individuals. Key factors for positive mental health and well-being for LGBTQ2S+ individuals include support from family and friends, particularly for youth, supportive workplaces and neighborhoods, addressing the social determinants of health. Some information for health providers. Rainbow Health Ontario, a provincial organization which seeks to promote the health of Ontario LGBTQ2S+ communities, recommends the following steps that can be taken by providers working with LGBTQ2S+ individuals. Increase awareness of the broader social and legal context in which LGBTQ2S+ clients live, become familiar with the degree to which internalized discrimination can impact on health, develop understanding of social determinants of both physical and mental health, promote family acceptance of LGBTQ2S+ adolescents, and encourage them to connect with LGBTQ2S+ communities. Provide appropriate equity training to ensure that suicide response and crisis intervention staff approach LGBTQ2S+ clients without stereotypes or discrimination, and that gender of trans clients is not misidentified. Improve recognition that individuals who belong to multiple marginalized communities may face additional barriers to maintaining good mental health. Increase familiarity with resources to support LGBTQ2S+ people at greatest risk for suicide, including youth and trans people.
Remember, you're not alone. Whatever your orientation or gender identity, it's important to realize that there are a lot of people like you. Many of them may have the same emotions and questions that you have. It can be comforting and helpful to talk to people who know what you're going through. You can find these people through local or online groups. If you don't know where to find support, check with your healthcare provider, your school counselor or trusted teacher, a therapist or other counselors, LGBTQ2S+ friends or relatives, LGBTQ2+ clubs and organizations in your community, website and online organizations.
There are comprehensive database on Vancouver Island's community health and wellness resources at services.viu.ca. You can also find a lot of great information on islandsexualhealth.org. Thank you for listening to this section, listeners. This is Sana signing off, and thank you for tuning in to A Sound Constitution on CHLY 101.7 FM.
Before we sign off for the day, I'm going to share this video clip from the Provincial Health Services Authority, or PHSA, their subdivision TransCare BC. The video is called Vision for Care for Trans Persons in BC. This video shares their vision to build a strong and sustainable network of care for trans British Columbians.
TransCare BC. What is it? First, it's about painting a vision of the future. A future where we recognize the mistakes made in the past and move forward from them. In this future, we means the community, healthcare professionals, and families embarking on a journey together. A future where we will work together in creating a system that provides equitable healthcare for all British Columbians. A system that helps trans individuals on their journey, wherever that journey leads. This means both creating some new services and making sure that existing services can be expanded. The long-term goal is to develop the knowledge, skills, and experience of healthcare professionals so that primary healthcare needs can be met closer to home. This includes hormone therapy, access to counseling, availability of accurate online information. And with the help of specialized healthcare navigators, people can be quickly connected to the services and support they need. We can provide a better healthcare experience for trans people with education and information for healthcare providers. This information and education helps. But equally, we need a willingness for us all to show our human side and acknowledge that we can learn from each other, patients and providers alike. In this system, people will have increased access to peer support networks in each health authority, where trans-identified peers will provide short-term emotional support, coaching, education, groups, and service referrals. Though some gender-affirming surgeries are already available regionally, other specialized services are less accessible. Therefore, TransCare BC will work towards improving wait times for readiness assessments, increasing the number of upper surgeries performed per year, improving follow-up support after lower surgeries, and eventually, planning for the provision of lower surgeries closer to home. Lending your voice is instrumental in the evolution of healthcare, and the road to a successful system is paved with participation and partnership. If we take these steps together, we can move mountains.
That was TransCare BC's Vision for Care for Trans Persons in BC, brought to you by the Provincial Health Services Authority, or PHSA. That's all we have time for today, folks. Let's all work together to build a more kind and caring and inclusive society. Thanks for listening.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. We encourage you to reach out to your healthcare provider for more information. As always, check out our Facebook page for resources for today's show. Every episode is uploaded to our YouTube channel if you'd like to hear it again.
If there are any topics you'd like to hear us discuss, let us know by email at asoundconstitution@gmail.com. Thank you for listening to A Sound Constitution on CHLY 101.7 FM.